All right. Well, we have part two of our notes. This you'll be taken on Tuesday, but I'm going to go ahead and record them today so that they're all together. Anyway, so it started us back at the beginning, and we talked about how Japan was sort of taking on the, there we go, aggressive activities that they were doing, getting us amped up for World War II, starting to take over Manchuria and Indochina. Attacking Pearl Harbor in 1941 is what brought us into the war. I'm going to get our laser pointer here in a minute. I showed you the map here. We're going to be looking at maps again. Continuing with our Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. Again, make sure you know who he is. He's the strategist that planned the war. We have our attacks on all sorts of European and American colonies and territories. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself, the damage it did, and that we actually came into war immediately after. Many of the victories that they had, Thailand, Hong Kong, Guam, Wake Island, and the Philippines, continuing into Malaya, Singapore, Dutch East Indies, and that's pretty much where we were, Burma in 1942, and I wanted to point out some things on the map. So eventually we're going to see all these islands. All these islands are red and Japanese controlled by 1942. Malaya is here, the Dutch East Indies. Again, we call them Indonesia now. French Indochina, which is Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. Siam, also known as Thailand, used to be known as Siam. Excuse me. And Burma. Hong Kong is right along the Chinese mainland here. I believe that is Hong Kong there. Singapore, we'll see in other maps, is right here at the tip of Malaya. So just to get some ideas. By the way, a couple of battles we're going to talk about both take place down here in this area off the coast of New Guinea and Australia. We have Guadalcanal, which we'll get to as a major battle, and the Battle of the Coral Sea is also right along in this area. So, excuse me. All right. I forgot to go to my laser pointer, which is cool. There we go. So, yeah, Guadalcanal and Battle for the Coral Sea. All right, cool. So that's where we left off with yesterday's presentation. So now we have this empire that Japan had been encouraging for years. They were trying to get a lot of these East Asian countries to not be colonized them, parts of the European nations. And they were promoting this idea of East Asia for the Asiatics, meaning it's better for an Asian to control these Asian territories than the Europeans. Seemingly taking on this different kind of role as a more, if Japan had been the ruler, a more noble and a more peaceful and a sort of promoting better treatment. Not the case at all. As conquerors, when they did conquer these areas, they were absolutely brutal to all of the peoples they conquered. Part of that is because what we talked about when we were watching the movie Unbroken. In general, the Japanese culture is very dominated by the idea of honor. Honor is extremely important in the Japanese culture. As a result, surrender is seen as dishonorable. And when you've done something dishonorable, it is so important to the Japanese culture that it almost makes you irrelevant and unimportant. So as they took over these places, anyone that surrendered, they looked down on. And as they would expect to be looked down on themselves. So that notion of treat others like you want to be treated, well, that's how they felt they should be treated if they surrendered. And when we learn about things like kamikaze pilots and planes that were willing to die for the cause, that they would fly their planes into things, you can understand that if they didn't do that, that would be seen as dishonorable, and they wouldn't want to live anyway. And it works well with the culture, obviously. All right. One example of their brutality in the territory of Bataan, they were moving a whole bunch of prisoners, and they actually forced this long 30-mile-a-day kind of march on the prisoners, and they did this for several days, and they kept up this pace and all sorts of things. Anyway, 23% of the people who were on that march died, 16,000 of 70, just from the march alone. So anyway, these are a couple pictures of the march. Obviously, I meant to move that other photo off to the side a bit more, but you get the idea. Okay, just wanted to take a minute. I mentioned at the early part yesterday about how by 1942, mid-1942, in Germany and then in the Pacific, both of these powers seemed unbeatable. They were just marching through places and taking them over quickly and immediately. And you can see over here in Europe, with Germany at the center, how by 1942 they had defeated part of the Soviet Union. They had taken over Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all those things that Russia had conquered. They had taken over the whole of Poland, with the Balkans falling, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary becoming allies, and conquering Greece and Yugoslavia. Obviously, this is not just Germany alone. This is Italy's territories as well. But you can just see the Axis powers seeming indomitable, unbeatable. And then the same in the Pacific, with how quickly they were able to move into Manchuria and then into China and Hong Kong, take over all of this area, about ready to launch an attack into India, the major British territory in the British Empire. Malaya and Singapore at the tip, Hong Kong up here, the Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, all of these islands, including the Philippines and Guam, that were American territories. It was an onslaught that was not going well for the Allied forces. And things will start to change in 1942, but this is sort of where we get to the turning point. But it was devastating, and the Allies were sort of defeated in a lot of ways. All right, this is where they start fighting back positively. In April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers ended up bombing several Japanese cities. And again, they didn't do a lot of damage, but it was the first time that Japan really could or showed itself to be vulnerable in any way. It was a huge morale boost for the Allied forces. And then we get to the Battle of the Coral Sea. We sort of see this as one of the first positive battles for the Allies. And sorry, trying to get the pointer off the screen. It was new. It was a different kind of battle. What happened with the battleships would be there, the aircraft carriers would be there, but rather than actually shooting at each other from the ships, it was just a place for sort of a mobile airstrip, and it became an air battle with the planes also trying to fight each other, but also bomb the boats themselves. And while there were more Allied losses than Japanese losses, it was successful because this was the first time that an attack by the Japanese was stopped. Up till now, every place they attacked, they conquered, and that wasn't true on this one. So the Battle of the Coral Sea is important as the first time the Allies kept the Japanese from taking over an area. All right, again, just sort of, this is the Coral Sea, and this is the battle. There's some cleverness with the way the Allied forces sort of hid and snuck up on the Japanese, but you have the Japanese coming from Japan this way, attempting to take over some more of these islands, and then you had the Allied forces led by the American fleet um, stop them here and turn the Japanese back. All right. The Battle of the Midway, or Battle of Midway, is one of the most famous battles, the most important turning points of the war for the U.S. If you look here, you have Hawaii, and Midway is here, and the Japanese Empire. So it's sort of, due east to Midway from Japan, and then out to Hawaii. But its turning point, June 7th, 1942, so the middle of 1942 is where things start to turn for the Allies, at least in the Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, he's a famous guy that you should know as well. He was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, so the naval part. Codebreakers had once again alerted America that there would be an attack, and they were actually able to surprise the Japanese, including General Yamamoto, and they destroyed 332 Japanese planes and all 4 of the aircraft carriers that were in the battle. Should also understand General Douglas MacArthur. He was the land forces commander in the Pacific, and he came up with the idea of the island hopping, which I believe we mentioned last week. But anyway, island hopping was this idea of sort of hopping over the islands that were well fortified. We needed the islands, but we were trying to, as bases, to get closer and closer to Japan. But we also needed to try to get rid of, or to avoid, in his view, the long drawn-out battles that would happen. So we went to islands that were not as well fortified, and we sort of hopped over some of their islands that they possessed and were full of soldiers and armaments and all sorts of military. So we seized some of the islands that were not as well defended, and yet a little bit closer to Japan, and it allowed us to hop across the Pacific and eventually get at Japan itself. The third battle that you'll need to know, and these will be the entire 3: the Battle of the Coral Sea, Battle of Midway, and Battle of Guadalcanal. Those are the 3 you'll need to know. This was more of a land battle than the others, and the Japanese were planning to use Guadalcanal as a military base. And while they were starting to take it over and build up their forces, General MacArthur attacked. So before it could become well fortified and all, a finished base, General MacArthur started this attack. And from August of 1942 to February of 1943, so about a 6-month period, this was a huge, huge battle that ravaged and went on. Many losses. The Japanese lost basically 2/3 of the men that were on the island, 24,000 of 36. And it was just huge, huge, devastating defeat for the Japanese. Eventually, in February of 1943, the Japanese pull out, so it was also a clear victory for the Allied forces. And they ended up calling Guadalcanal the Island of Death. This became, again, a huge battle as the tide started to change in 1942 in the middle of the year, in the summer. By the time we get into 1943, with this huge victory for the Allies, the tide really starts to change in America, and the Allied forces really start to defeat Japan. Again, this is just some picture of the forces entering the island and some of the activity on the island. And then here's a map. Again, you'd have Japan up this way off the map. You'd have Hawaii out this way off the map. And Guadalcanal is in that row of islands. This is New Guinea, and this is Australia that we've looked at several times. All right, so that's it for this recording. I have about 10 seconds left, so I have to get them in under 15 minutes. Hope you're well, and we'll talk to you soon.